Thank you. Good morning. I couldn't have asked for better weather since I've been here the past few days. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's been really a joy to be a part of your community over the past couple of days. I understand that this is a complex and nuanced place. I couldn't possibly digest all there is to digest about Chautauqua in a couple of days, but it really has been a joy. When I have small, intimate conversations with new friends like this, I like to give a little bit of background about who I am, so you know what sort of shaped me and my work. The first point that I'll share is that I'm originally from Oklahoma. I am from Oklahoma City, but grew up in a small town that didn't have streetlights. My cousin was the mayor. My uncles ran the fire department. And the idea of a porch resonates with me loudly. We would sit on porches and wave at neighbors and tell stories about people, AKA gossip, about people who were walking by, driving by. My father, who was a city boy, used to joke that when we drove down the main drag of the town, that he would just hold down the horn instead of honking each time, because everyone was a relative and everyone was a friend, and it was just easier that way. I am also a mother to an adorable 5-year-old who I don't usually talk about when I give professional talks, but I decided that I'm not thinking about this so much as a professional talk, as more of a reflection among friends, really learning from the space of Chautauqua of being open and engaging and being vulnerable, and that is what promotes growth. And so I'm sharing with you one of the most vulnerable parts of my life, this very special little boy who is the reason why I do everything that I do. I myself, thank you. I myself am a lifelong learner. This is a picture of me at age 9 with my first invention. I invented snow chains for bicycles so that you could ride your bike in the snow. When you got your bike for Christmas, you wanted to actually use it, so let's put some snow chains on that bad boy and get out in the streets. So I've been solving complicated problems for a very, very long time, as you can see. As Amit mentioned, I describe myself as a transdisciplinary scholar. I am a psychologist by training, but have worked and trained across multiple disciplines. And that's really central to the work that I do. There's a more than a small degree of humility that comes along with taking that approach. That approach suggests that there's not one discipline that can solve the types of problems that I'm trying to solve. And it also acknowledges that I alone can't fix these complicated issues. I use teams of people, lots of conversations, lots of points of input to help me think about and address the complexities of racism in our society. I like this quote because it embodies that so well, that says, there are those who solve the problems of their disciplines and those who solve the problems of the world. And those who are trying to solve the problems of the world couldn't dare to rely on a single perspective or a single discipline. And I embody that in all of the work that I do. A lot of my work has focused on, I focus on the very fun topic of racism. I know you're all very excited to talk about this. I focus on how we characterize racism. What does that mean? How do we conceptualize that? I think about the ways in which we measure racism. So I'm also trained in social epidemiology and population health. So I think about how do we measure it so we can get a sense of what the effects are on health. But I also think about how we engage it. What do we do about it? Not just thinking and talking and measuring and pontificating in the ways that professors are known to do. But how do we actually get out in the world and do something about it? And that's the piece of my work that I'll be sharing with you today. Before we get started, I thought that I would share some context to set up my remarks with you today. So the first is that I've been professionally engaged with the topic of racism for over 20 years. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this carefully, reading, researching, etc. And there are a few points in, I also engage a lot with public audiences like this. And there are a few points over the course of that 20 years, I'm not doing a brain dump today, but just a few points that I think are important to keep in mind as we move forward. So the first is that if we're being honest, authentic, and complex in our conversations about racism, we will likely experience some discomfort. And what I will argue is that there is growth in that discomfort, and ask you to not run from it, but to sit in it and figure out why you're experiencing that discomfort, and what is it that you need to learn or talk about or discuss or reflect on to help you move forward. I'm also not seeking your agreement or approval. I'm not here to prove anything to you. I'm here to share what I've learned, and I'm actively invested in your growth around these issues, in your thinking around these issues. My goal is not to have you believe what I believe. I'm not here to indoctrinate you. My goal is, again, to support your journey in establishing your own beliefs and interrogating your own beliefs. I'm also not seeking to offer resolution, and perhaps not even clarity. I'd like for us to focus instead on unraveling, complicating things, getting a little bit messy. I'll raise questions today and give points for you to consider that I believe are the basis of people who have an informed and critically engaged point of view about racism. This will undoubtedly require more time and reading and reflection and discussion than we have today. So you may leave not feeling resolved or clear, but maybe in a state of reflection. Racism must be framed and understood as being multidimensional. It's not one thing. It's not just something that happens between people. It exists in our structures and systems and in our cultures. And when we're thinking about this intersection of empathy, racism, and race, it's important for us to think about that it's not just about relationships between us. It's about how these things manifest as a part of our socio-cultural fabric. We also can't meaningfully engage racism without saying the word racism. I'm going to say it a lot today. I can see people squirm in their seats when I say the word racism. But it's important for us to not dilute it with words that make you or others more comfortable. It's important to name what it is that we're talking about. It's also important that when we're talking about racism, which is tied to my conversation around empathy, that we name whiteness. It's not invisible in our conversations about race and racism, and it's important for us to name. At the intersections of empathy, race, and racism, we must consider not only the feelings and experiences of others. We've talked a lot about that this week. We must also see ourselves, perhaps more clearly because of our attempts to see and understand others. And to remember that emotion, individual experiences, and perspectives are never divorced from vast social, political, and cultural context. Empathy is not just personal, it is social and political. And I hope to unpack that a bit with you today. Virtual reality is the ultimate empathy machine. Chris Milk, who is a prominent VR creator, I think he probably regrets saying this because it's a quote that gets used all the time, but VR is seen as this powerful machine that can transport you to different worlds and put you into experiences that you couldn't possibly experience otherwise. Raise of hand, who has experienced virtual reality before? You've had on a headset. Did your grandchildren convince you to put this on and fly a plane or fly through the sky? When I started this work in virtual reality, I had never even had a headset on my head. I barely understood what it was. But I wanted to build on this adage of walking a mile in someone's shoes. If you could just walk a mile in my shoes, might you understand racism differently than me just explaining it to you or you just reading about it? If I could put you into an experience where you weren't an observer, you were actually having it happen to you, a first-person point of view, a front seat to an experience of racism. Might that change the ways in which people engaged? And ultimately, that's empathy, right? That's a tool, a mechanism to get us to empathy. But I've also reached this point where I had to question whether empathy was sufficient. Is simply understanding the perspective of someone experiencing racism enough? I've also had to question whether racial empathy was possible. Can 10 minutes in a headset really help you understand the perspective and emotions of someone going through this sort of experience? Where I've landed is that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism. not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of science, which is where my work sits most of the time, but rather a visceral understanding that connects to spirit and body as much as reason. And my exploration was considering whether virtual reality could give us that sort of visceral connection with racism. When we think about racism, we're not only thinking about sort of abstract ideas or experiences or things that are far removed from us. I like Ta-Nehisi's Coates' reflection on this, where he says, but for all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And if we are invested in some notion of racial justice, we need to connect with that. We need to connect with the reality of that. What we find empirically is that white people in particular don't understand racism. And I know it can make white people uncomfortable to be named as a group. When we talk about race, we're talking about the marginalized, we're talking about the oppressed. But white people in our reflections and dealing with the realities of racism have a stake in this as well. And when we measure and ask them, how much do you think racial injustice is a factor in our society, they misestimate significantly. How big do you think the racial wealth gap is? The racial wealth gap, according to our data, will be this. Consistently, white people, and actually people in general, will think it's this. We overestimate racial progress. We're all doing fine, right? We're doing okay. Things are not as bad as they used to be. So there's this tendency to misrepresent what racism is and just how little we've gained in terms of racial equity in our society. When I was thinking about my work in virtual reality, I had to think about who am I speaking to? Who's my target audience? And I thought specifically about the choir, and I found this great picture to represent that. This is the group of people who, they're at the rallies, they're at the marches, they sign the petitions, they truly believe in racial justice and racial equity and have been engaged in that fight. But they also consistently misrepresent what racism is and just how deeply embedded it is in our society and systems. There's also this tendency in wanting to invest in being seen as a member of the choir and not doing the work that's required of us as a member of the choir. There's an investment in wanting to be seen as a good person, in someone who wouldn't be that bad person over there doing those bad things over there. I often joke that if I were to hand out cute stickers that said "not racist," you could wear that proudly, and people would know you're a good person and you're not racist, whether that's true or not. But that's an investment in how you're seen. That's an investment about whether people think you're a good person. That's not working against racism. And too often the choir is more invested in being seen a particular way and less invested in the work of fighting against racism. Again, discomfort that might be rising as I talk about this. I like this. Dr. George Yancey wrote a letter to white America in the New York Times, and I encourage you to read it. And in it, he says, I ask you to look deep, to look into your souls with silence, to quiet that voice that will speak to you of your white innocence. Take a deep breath. Make space for my voice in the deepest parts of your psyche. Try to listen, try to practice being silent. Again, I'm not trying to convince you to agree with me. I'm asking you to listen and consider what I have to say. In my work in virtual reality, I'm asking, can I improve your understanding of racism? Rooted in this argument that improving one's understanding of racism is what's necessary for us to actually address the actual problem and make real progress toward racial justice. I've created an experience along with some collaborators at Stanford University, what we call a thousandcut journey. where I wanted to try and represent some of the complexities of what it's like to experience racism from the perspective of a Black male. So for those of you who have experienced virtual reality, you know you can put on a headset and you can interact with the world around you. In this experience, we have you embody the life of Michael Sterling as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult. When you see yourself, and I'll show you a video in just a minute, you can move the body, control the body, you look in a mirror, and regardless of who's in the headset, you see yourself in the mirror as a young brown boy. And then you see yourself transition at different points across the life course as you go through a set of experiences. In the first experience, you are a child. So you see yourself, you wave to yourself in the mirror, you're a child in a classroom, and if you're able, we ask you to sit on the floor and play with blocks. And you can see yourself grabbing and stacking blocks, and you're interacting with children in the classroom. And the children say things like, "Mike, throw the fireball, throw the scary black fireball. Black is always the scariest." What we're representing here is the ways in which a racial narrative enters our psyches at a very young age. Even if we fancy ourselves colorblind. I don't like to talk about race. I just see people as human. We live in a world that's giving us messages about race and value and worth that get absorbed by our children. Black is always the scariest, throw the scary black fireball. We encourage you and goad you basically into throwing the blocks like the other kids are throwing blocks. Most people do. Most people throw the block at the kid that said, "Throw the scary black fireball," and usually aim right for his head. When you throw that block, it triggers a white female teacher who's out of the shot of this screenshot who says, "Michael, you're being dangerous. You're going to hurt someone." She's previously ignored the other children throwing those blocks, but interacts with you and says, "You're going to hurt someone." What's important to note here is that I am a social scientist. I love data as much as the next person, and it was important for me to incorporate that data into this experience. So we know empirically that Black boys in particular are disciplined more harshly for the same behaviors in classrooms, and we wanted to represent that in this experience. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything that the other kids weren't doing. You may not have even thrown the block at all, and you'll still get this reaction from the teacher. We wanted to incorporate all of that. Speaking of developmental trajectories as it relates to an awareness of race and racism, we know that children as young as 3 years old notice and start to categorize people based on our visual indicators. You're a girl, you're a boy, you're Black, you're white. By age 5, those same children start to associate values to that. Girls do this, boys do that, Black means this, white means that. So we're representing the emergence of that in this experience, and it also speaks to, if that is happening across the board developmentally for all of our children, and we're refusing to talk about and engage race and its significance in our society, what meaning, what conclusions would they draw about where we are and who we are as a people, as a society, as it relates to race, if we aren't actively intervening? In the virtual reality experience, you see yourself in a mirror and you transition to a slightly older adolescent version of yourself. We have you wave, connect with the body, remember that you're not you necessarily, that you're this avatar, and then you transition into your bedroom in your home in Brooklyn, New York. You're able to walk around the room, you can toss a basketball, you can look at the posters on your wall. You get a phone call from a cell phone, you have to turn and find it. You grab the cell phone, it's your friend Adam who's saying, "Hey, come downstairs, we're going to be late for the basketball game." You then transition to a living room where your mother is sitting on a couch watching television. As you prepare to leave, your mother stops you and says, "Michael, you need to change. The police are looking for someone who's dressed similarly to you." Your friend Adam intervenes, "It's not a big deal, don't worry about it." And your mother says, "Don't forget what happened to your brother." In this, what are we representing? Because this is also an experience of racism. We're representing a mother having to be hyper-vigilant about what her child is wearing out of fear of what might happen to them if he has an interaction with the police. A white friend who doesn't quite get it about the significance of what the mother is asking and requesting. You grab a jacket, you change, you head out to the street. Your neighbors are greeting you, wishing you good luck at the game, and suddenly a police car pulls up and 3 officers are standing right next to you. So again, you're in a headset and you're looking at 3 officers looking directly at you. They're yelling at you. You're probably feeling confused because again, you were just standing on the sidewalk talking to your neighbors. Get down on the ground and put your hands up. And you, the user, have a choice to make. Do you get down on your knees and raise your hands in the air? Most people do. And in that moment where you're yelling and there's chaos in the neighborhood and your neighbors are yelling at you, the lights go out and it goes dark and it gets quiet. And you hear that same mother, you hear your mother's voice saying, just do what you have to do to get home alive. Not everyone has to explain that to their children. Not everyone has to fear an encounter with the police in quite the same way. Not everyone really understands how you can have an encounter with the police and then be confused about what's happening because you're not the person they're looking for. But when you put on this headset, for a split moment, you get to experience a piece of that. And think about how you feel in your body, fear, shame, whatever's coming up for you. You get to experience that firsthand. Later in the experience, we have you transition to adulthood, early adulthood. You're wearing a suit and tie, and you're on your way to a big job interview. You are entering a space that is decidedly white. The founders on the wall are white, all the magazines have white faces, everyone who works in the space is white, you're the one brown face in this space. You go to the receptionist to hand your resume in, and she's very rude to you and says, you can put that over there, and is sort of dismissive. Okay, that could just be a person having a bad day. When you hand in the resume, you have some information about yourself. I see someone in the audience wearing a Yale sweater. There you are. You see a Yale logo on the resume. I just thought that sounded fancy. I have no affiliation with Yale whatsoever. But we wanted to give you a sense of you might be qualified to do this job, right? You might be in a pretty good position. You then meet another applicant who says, and speaking to you in a way where he's sort of blackening the way that he's talking. Hey man, what's up? You know, these interviews are tough, blah, blah, blah. When the interviewer comes in and approaches this other applicant, he changes the way that he's speaking, right? He's gone back to his regular tone of voice. And the interviewer says, you must be an applicant from Yale. We're so excited to meet you. And he says, no, sir, I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State. I went to the University of Michigan, so that was my way. Go blue. That was my dig. No. Just, nothing against Michigan State. It's not Michigan. I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State. And then the receptionist in the background says, actually, that's Michael. He's the candidate from Yale. And it's the first time that the interviewer turns to acknowledge your presence at all. He has completely ignored that you're there prior to that point. There was a moment in this scene where the interviewer turns and says, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. You don't mind if I take him back first, do you? There's a moment in that scene, there was a white woman in the headset who put out her hand, waiting for her hand to be shaken and waiting to be acknowledged. It's never going to happen. It's not technically possible yet in VR. But the visual of this woman waiting to be seen and acknowledged was just so striking to me. In this moment when you had been completely disregarded. And in some ways, given the goals of the VR, we've made you feel invisible and unseen. I want to give you a sense of what this looks like for those of you who haven't used VR before. Is this playing? Can you play that video, please? So when you're using virtual reality, this type of virtual reality, there's very little lag. When you move, the avatar moves. And this is just an example of a user in the headset moving. No, it's not playing. The user in the headset moving in front of a mirror. So it gives you a sense of, if you can see yourself in the mirror, we're trying to build some sense of embodiment and connection to this avatar. We want you to some degree, and I can talk about this later because we weren't completely successful in this. We want you to some degree forget who you are and feel like you're this other person. So you can see the movement happening there. So we use mirrors throughout the experience. And I should go back and say that my collaborator at Stanford, Jeremy Bailenson, has been working in VR for over 20 years. White guy, doesn't do a lot of work around race or racism, but I approached him and said, hey, you don't know me, I don't know anything about VR, but might you be interested in working on this project together? And he's been doing virtual reality work, thinking about social and behavioral applications of VR for over 20 years. And part of what they found is having to see yourself as someone else in a mirror in virtual reality is a powerful tool for empathy. It's a powerful tool for helping you feel like what they're experiencing is what you're experiencing. And it's one of the unique and powerful features of VR. Also, having to use your body, so asking you to get down on your knees and put your hands up, having you pick up a cell phone or throw a basketball, become important features of VR. You're not an observer, you're in it. This is your environment. You have to use this body in ways that you choose and see fit, even if we're goading you in particular directions. So it's important for you to use the body that you're in order to feel connected to it. So in the next clip, I'm going to show you some clips that kind of jump around throughout the experience to give you a sense of what this looks like and sounds like. But it's important to remember it's not meant to be experienced this way. It's meant to be experienced in a headset where you're sort of tuning out the outside world and taking you and transporting you to another place. But this will be helpful just to give you a sense of what it feels like.
Look at your reflection in the mirror. Take one step closer and examine your new body. Wave to yourself. You've now become Michael Sterling. Your friends call you Mike. You are 6 years old and in the first grade.
Using this block. No, you can have it. What are you making? I'm making a Minecraft dungeon. It can't be blown. Cool.
That was crazy.
Are you okay, honey? Do you want me to call your mother?
Just brush it off. Like, I hope you're ready for the game.
Please put that in the box. Here.
Hey, what's up, man? Hey, what's your name again? These interviews have been crazy. Glad they're almost over.
Is that them? Are they calling about the job? Listen to the voicemail.
Hi, Michael. I just wanted to call and thank you for coming in today.
So in the experience, we're not possibly representing what it's like to be a black man over the course of a life course in 10 minutes of being in virtual reality. The intent is to provide some insight into things that you may not normally notice or experience. In sharing some of what we learned over the course of doing this work, one of the pieces that has come up is even though we were attempting to make you feel like a black man wearing a headset, we often find that people say, especially white people, say they feel more white. They're more salient of just how different their day-to-day experience is by embodying an experience that's very different than their own. We've also learned that empathy is not sufficient. And it goes back to my earlier remarks. When we talk about empathy, we're often talking about observing and understanding other people. In this work, though, it's also important for you to understand yourself. What do you think? What do you feel? What do you think about what you're seeing this other person experience? Do you understand the context that actually produced that emotion in that individual experience? And staying connected to this intersection between person and environment. Empathy is one important step along the way. VR is potentially a very powerful tool for giving you perspectives that you couldn't possibly take on in a deep and immersed and meaningful way using any other tool that we currently have. But that's not the same thing as analyzing yourself as it relates to racism. It's not the same thing as seeing yourself as a part of racist systems. It's not the same thing as analyzing how we got here and why we're here. So when I say understand racism, that's the piece that I'm trying to push more people toward. Sure, our connections, empathy, understanding each other's perspectives are important, but so is understanding yourself. And so is understanding the context that produced all of that. One of the things that's most powerful about VR is that it doesn't allow you to remove yourself. You're always welcome, of course, to take off the headset, and I'll give you a story about that in a minute, but you're in it. You're controlling the body. It's happening to you. You're not a fly on the wall. You're not being told a story. You're having to interact with it yourself through the eyes of someone else. So it's potentially quite powerful, I think, and the evidence, empirical evidence suggests that. We're also finding through a series of empirical studies that it changes the ways people see and acknowledge structural inequities. Again, moving not only to, is racism something that happens between people, but also understanding that racism exists in policies and it exists in cultures. And we're finding that people who go through this experience start to get more clarity about that. A common refrain is also, I thought I understood this, but I don't, which is exactly where I hoped people would land. I don't want anyone, and thank goodness no one has said this to me, I don't want anyone coming out of the headset saying, I know exactly what it's like to be a black man now. I've been in a headset for 10 minutes. Don't say that. Not true. Not possible. But what I'm finding is that people are actually more open. Man, I don't think I quite understand this in the way that I thought I did. I've been missing something. This is different. I'm understanding this in a different way. That creates openness. That changes the way we have conversations about this. If you come to a conversation and you're resolved and you think you have it all figured out, there's nothing I can say to change your mind. But if you enter a conversation, this very difficult, complicated issue, and you enter a conversation about racism thinking, maybe I don't understand it, maybe I'm missing something, we'll end up in a very different place because we've started the conversation in a very different place. And I'm finding, after running thousands and thousands of people through this experience, that that's the case, that people are more open, more vulnerable, and more willing to engage in these difficult conversations. We first premiered this work at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018, and you know, I'm a professor, I don't go to film festivals, that's way fancier than my pay grade, and didn't know what I was doing. And Tribeca's particularly she is a word my mother would use. So we have this booth, blank white walls, and we're supposed to do something with that. People have entire construction crews building out living rooms and booths, and I'm like, we have blank walls. So I send one of my students to go get some black markers from the Michaels up the street, and we write along the wall a thousand-cut journey, and we make our walls a blank slate for people to write on when they come out of the headset. Pretty creative solution for people who didn't know what they were doing. So over the course of 2 weeks at this film festival, people wrote on the walls. What were they thinking? What were they feeling after going through something like this? I'm going to share a few stories, but you can imagine the range of reactions people have after going through an experience like this. But they were saying things like, you think you know how something feels until you experience it. Eye-opening. Can't stop thinking about this project. F racism. Truly eye-opening. So this is not empirical data, right? We have a whole set of studies that we run in a laboratory, but this was our first indication that people were reacting to this in a way that was deeply meaningful and lasting and going beyond the 10 minutes in their headset. I want to share 3 short stories with you. Again, I've run thousands of people. I work with corporations, universities around the country using this work. So I have a lot of stories, but there are 3 that always stick with me that I tend to share when I give talks like this. So the first is I had a white female colleague from Columbia go through the experience who told me several weeks after she'd come out of the headset that she was walking down the street in New York City and a police officer was walking toward her. And she got scared. And she said her palms started sweating, her heart rate increased, And she said to me, I've never been afraid of the police. I've never had a reason to be. But in that moment, I was afraid. Now, whether that's the effect we want to create or not is up for discussion, but it was an effect that we created. And what it suggested is that it was translating outside of the headset, that she was carrying this with her beyond that 10 minutes. And that's part of what we want. We want it to last. We don't want you to just have an emotional experience and feel badly when you take off the headset or while you're in the headset. We want you to keep thinking about it, and she clearly was. There are lots of people who cry while they're in the headset, outside of the headset, who come out kind of like a deer in headlights, not quite knowing what to say. That's the immediate response. What I'm interested in is what happens to you 7 weeks later, a year later. How are you engaging differently? A second story is when I first understood that I had designed this for a white audience, but what does it mean to put a black person in a headset experiencing racism in virtual reality? First event, our debut, we're having a party celebrating the launch of this. A black male colleague, again at Columbia, puts on the headset. He knows it's about racism. We forgot to mention the police scene. Puts on the headset, gets to the police scene, and he almost takes the headset off right in the middle of it. He doesn't take it off, he keeps it on. And when I talked to him later, I said, I saw you almost took off the headset. What was happening? What was going on? He said, I couldn't hear what the police officers were saying, and I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't comply, because it's loud and it's a party and he couldn't hear. That's how real that felt to him. The third experience is someone who went through the experience in the lab, not a colleague, not a professor, but a white female from London, went through the experience in the lab, and she left and went to a coffee shop and sent me a message shortly after. And I wish I would have included the text from the message, but she said, Michael is a part of me now. I just received a story about police violence in the UK. It was a rapper talking about his experience. And she said, I didn't read that as an intellectual engagement with the media. It became personal. It felt personal. She was engaging with that media content in a different way just an hour after going through this experience. And whether she continues to do that or not, I don't know yet. But it speaks to kind of the range of things that happen to people when they go through these sorts of experiences. And they're not all positive, they're not all transformative. But it's clear to me that there's possibility in the technology to bring us closer to understanding, not only in the form of empathy, but also understanding the world and society around us in a more deep and meaningful way. Part of the work that we're doing now is pushing beyond putting you into an individual's shoes, but starting to think about how we can visualize structural racism. How do we do that? Dr. Cho yesterday talked about redlining, how neighborhoods were created and how we decided which neighborhoods get resources or not. That's an example of structural racism. How do we visualize that so you understand the implications of that? Can I use virtual reality to help you understand how redlining has direct implications for COVID infections and mortality? I can say that, I can explain that, but what if you can see it, and what if you can interact with it? So part of what we're doing is thinking about how to use data visualization, taking data models that we have from across disciplines, addressing a number of different issues, and incorporating that visually into virtual reality. So that if you're standing on a street in Brooklyn, can I allow you to manipulate time? That neighborhood, drag time forward 5 years, drag time backwards 5 years, and see how a policy decision about housing has an effect on the physical environment. See how introducing a policy like stop and frisk in New York City affects people differently on the street. Virtual reality has lots of possibilities, but it's not a magic pill. You're not going to put on a headset and somehow come out with some deep new awareness of what's going on. What it can do, though, is open your mind in a way, I think, that helps us engage and talk in a different way. I've had the privilege of talking to audiences like this, but often I'm in small groups in small rooms, and I can see those shifts happen in deep and meaningful ways. Before they go through the VR, how are they talking versus how they talk with each other and with me after having gone through the VR. I can see the shift. So for me, I came in as a skeptic. I came in as someone who didn't really understand what this technology was, but it really started to understand that when you take an approach that brings together people from different perspectives, not relying just on me, not relying just on my training as a psychologist, but bringing in multiple points of view and multiple disciplines together to address this complicated problem, maybe we can start to put a chunk in addressing some of the issues of this complicated issue in society. So coming back to the notion of the porch, which I'm fond of as an Oklahoman from this small town, and I've appreciated seeing you all on your porches here, talking, having meaningful conversations. I'm assuming I'm not hanging out by your porch and eavesdropping on what you're talking about. But I do understand the significance. I already understand the significance of the porch in Chautauqua. So I want to offer some food for thought. So again, this is not about resolution. This is not about tying this in the bow. This is about unsettling, unraveling. We've been thinking about empathy and its significance. We're talking about racism in the context of empathy now. These are points that I just want you to think about and consider as you continue your conversations beyond today. If racism is not only interpersonal, but structural, cultural, and institutional in nature, what are the limits of empathy? How far will empathy take us? We all experience racism. You are not a neutral observer of racism. You are both an active and passive participant and recipient. I don't need you to like me. I need you to hate racism. Racism is not out there, it's right here. Are you choosing comfort over growth? What do you believe about racism? Are my beliefs and understanding of racism driven by emotion and gut instinct, or thoughtful and critical reflection and education? Are you racially competent? If you believe racism exists and is bad, who was responsible for doing something about it? Or is simply believing it's bad sufficient? If you don't believe racism exists or is exaggerated, what is your analysis of racial patterns that we see in society? What evidence do we have that supports that we live in a racially equitable society? I'm often asked to prove that racism exists. I'm asking you to prove that it doesn't. Are racial groups better or worse off because of their own efforts? If so, does that analysis lead you to the conclusion that some racial groups are just better than others? Are my actions aligned with my beliefs? Am I okay with the sticker that says not racist, or am I doing something about it? Do I value being perceived as a good person more than engaging the realities of racism? Am I more comfortable talking, thinking, and casually disagreeing with racism than actually taking action against it? What do I not understand? Where are my points of tension or resistance in my thinking about racism? Does my engagement of racism primarily take the form of intellectual exercise and symbolic gestures? Black Lives Matter stickers, etc. And lastly, I ask you to consider, is anti-racism very different than simply being empathetic? Thank you.